try to not trip over this cord. Okay, cool. Hi everyone. Thanks for showing up. And as Colin mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about experimentation at Spotify, how we're going to try to scale that up. But before that, I just want to take a couple of minutes to take you through like our general approach to data and how we develop based on that. Is the microphone okay? Just like distance from my mouth? Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to quickly talk you through like the mindset of how we approach data, give you a couple of examples around how we put that in practice. And then when I want to focus more around experimentation, I'm going to like our ambitions to really like at the critical inflection point there right now. Nope. Yep. Cool. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about, that's a quote from our VP of Data and Design, Rochelle King. Through design, we give our users a voice, and the data is what they are telling us. Everything that says is just that product design, everything you build, everything you put into action, and data should have like a relationship. That relationship is not necessarily only one way or the other, but it's kind of circular. What I mean by that is, usually at the start you have data, right? Any data point. It can be an observation, a tweet, a photograph, something that you actually kind of collect in a data warehouse, whatever. From that you form insights, so something that you can talk about, something you think is probably true, but you have no way of kind of actually kind of quantifying it, but it's based in something you can quantify. And then you take an action on that. So you take a design action, you take an implementation, you develop a product. And from that point in time, you suddenly have something that you can then get new data on, right? That's what she mentioned, what she meant with design being a language and data, what people are telling us, right? That whatever we build, whatever we kind of put out there, gives people a new way of interacting with us, and that's something we can listen to. The next thing, slightly less conceptual, is looking at types of data. And I just talk a little bit about that, but I really want to nail home the point that data is not necessarily just in this format, right? Data is something that can be very human, something that can be contextual, situational, something that is very rich and has like facets, if you will, right? So a lot of people talk about data in the terms of qual and quant, and I really don't like that because it kind of narrows your view into having either qual data, which is talking to people and talking about emotions and being fuzzy, or you have quant, right, which is kind of huge, mathematical, powerful, you should always trust that. And that's kind of overlooking that there are so many different angles and dimensions to that you can explore. Like you can look at data, whether it's based in single measurements, whether it's being measured over time. You can look at data and look at whether it's actually qualitative, so describing something, or whether it's quantitative and measuring something. If you just kind of, let me not go into this otherwise I'll go up for a rant for the next 3 minutes. But just kind of a little bit more on that topic is that what I generally try to tell or teach my product owners and like stakeholders that are not data literate themselves, so they don't have a research or academic background, I try to get them to look at data through 2 lenses. So the first lens is, if you think about making like a jigsaw puzzle, right? The first process is you're just going through that box and you're trying to figure out how this whole thing will fit together, right? You're looking for maybe the corners, maybe some just kind of, like blue sky-like pieces. And then you're trying to figure out the lay of the land. At some point though, you will then shift to a different mode of thinking, and that is, okay, I'm looking for this kind of, like it has these 3 kind of fingers and it needs to be half blue and half gray, and then you look at the box for precisely that piece. And this kind of 2 different modes, what I try to teach my stakeholders about how they should approach research, right? Come to us and either say, I don't really have a clue about this, we're going to launch in a new market and we kind of don't really understand how they're operating. And then we know what research methods to map to that. Or you come to us and say, hey, we're releasing this new product and we really need to know exactly if it's better than the old one. And then again, that's a different way of going about it. And again, at this stage, telling us that you want some qual or quant research isn't really all that meaningful, right? So it's kind of this mindset of keeping a constant loop of exploring things, like throwing up dirt and just seeing what comes up, and then validating it, right? To form a hypothesis and really say, okay, this is something we need to nail down, this is something where we really want high precision on, and then you run an A/B test, you run a survey like with 5,000 people instead of 50, those things. Cool. So super quickly going to run you through our research practice and how that leads up. So as I mentioned, data can be everything. So in this case, for example, we're going into people's homes and we're looking at how they're using computers to listen to music. That gives us a lot of data points, that gives us very rich data, that gives us probably more data than we can quantify. And it's also data that doesn't necessarily benefit from quantifying too much. But because we still need to know whether that is kind of relevant, what we observe is we can extrapolate that to a bigger group, we might then run a survey, right? Where we kind of take our observations and we run a survey, then we group our numbers and we see, okay, actually what we saw was not the most frequent thing, something else is actually way more frequent. If we want to have even more precision and now our idea is becoming more concrete, right now we know what we're looking for, we might be looking at search queries, for example. So if we found, hey, people really tell us that they are looking for this latest album, we can look whether it's really kind of in the top search ranks or not. And then that would be an interesting insight in itself. So from all these data points, we aggregate an insight. People listen to music when partying, for example, right? That could be something that isn't the biggest shocker, but based on the data we're getting, that is maybe more important than people listen to music when swimming. So what do we do with all that insights? Now we go into action mode, and we run a couple of user tests, for example, with a prototype, right? So we're building different prototypes with design ideas. Now we start giving that some shape, and then we're building, setting up certain tests. So in this case, we run user testing, usability testing, very, very kind of, you can do card sorts or whatever fits the research problem. In this case, we have a prototype, we evaluate it, and then ultimately we end up with something like this, that some of you may know if you're using Spotify, has been pretty well received. So a feature that's ideally the end result of a lot of research and a lot of data. And here we move into the next section because now we need to know how well it actually does. So the problem I'm seeing a lot, and something that actually theoretically everybody knows, but in practice even analysts get wrong oftentimes. I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing is, say, this is an example that's just out of thin air. Say we see people who build playlists in Spotify are more likely to retain, right? It doesn't sound all that crazy. So what should we do? Let's go into action mode and get people to build more playlists, right? Because reasonably we assume playlisting leads to higher retention. Now if you've paid attention, you may see a problem with that, because what we've seen was correlational data, and it could also be that retention leads to people just building more playlists, right? It could be just an artifact of the measurement. Or, even more likely, there are other variables that cause this both, right? So people could be music enthusiastic, and then they build more playlists and they retain, because it's a product built for music enthusiasts. Or they have more tech experts, or whatever else, right? The third variable that causes both variables that we have been observing. So it's obviously all about correlation versus causation. That's what I mean. Like if you tell people, hey, correlation is not causation, everyone will be like, yeah, I know, I've learned that in kind of middle school. But in practice, people screw this up all the time. So whenever you see data that suggests, oh, if we just raise this, it will also raise that, make sure the data is actually causal. And what data is causal? Data that's coming out of controlled experiments. I mean, there are a couple of other methods like, multiple regression, etc. But nothing yields as strong causal data as controlled experiments. So what we need to do, and I'll go over this rather quickly, because some of you may already be familiar with it, you need a population, and then you randomize this population into two groups, right? So you throw a dice for every person, and you go into that group or that group. Pretty standard process. But this is really important because what it will do is it will keep all the differences that occur naturally in people, right? How much music enthusiasm they have, how much tech expertise they have. All that should, at the end of the day, be randomly distributed between the two groups. So on the statistical level, those two groups are identical, except that group B has received something that group A hasn't received, and that is in our control, right? In our power, not in our control. Control. Cool, so we get the results of both, and then in order to see if there's actually been a meaningful difference, we need to run a statistical test that's appropriate to our approach. and then hopefully we'll have our answer. And that leads us to the ambition that we see ourselves with right now. Because at Spotify, we've always run A/B tests. That's been a method of deployment for like way before I started. But what we've come to see is that like A/B testing and experimentation has this huge potential in learning, in establishing causal understanding of your user base, of your product, and that doesn't work at the scale that we've been doing this. And I'll go through this in a bit. So these are 4 things that we're trying to get better at the moment, which we feel are essential to experimentation. So the first thing is variation, right? So you need to produce more different takes on things. If you want to get people to build more playlists, don't just build one way of doing that, like build 10, or at least come up with 10, right? Validation, that kind of comes down to what are you doing to figure out which is best. And that's where the technical part of the A/B testing comes in, right? Where you run a test, whatever test it is, to just determine, hey, with that percentage of chance, like this is better than that, whatever you want to do. Like I'm not going to go into the details. Then you need volume, because if you do that like once a month, then what's the point, right? You want to do this at a high enough scale, and luckily we have like so many users that it makes a lot of sense to do that at scale, and we have the opposite problem. To make use of that huge user base, you need to produce just way more variation, but you may find yourself in the opposite problem. And lastly, learning, I've singled that out here because the first 3 steps are kind of almost like an evolutionary process, right? You just throw stuff at the wall, you see what sticks, and you do that enough so you end up with a better product. But obviously we want to kind of shortcut that. We want to see what have we learned from the past, what hypotheses have we built that worked or didn't work, in order to build better experiments, in order to build experiments that are more likely to succeed. We know that there's likely a limit to the success rate that experiments can have, but we still want to try to max that out. And these are the 3 kind of levels that we think there are to do that. So we've grouped that as platform, process, and culture. I'm going to through each of these very quickly. So, did I just press the wrong thing? No, cool. So, a couple of questions we're asking ourselves when we think about our A/B testing platform is, are we supporting all the use cases, right? So we could build a great A/B testing platform for our PlayStation app. But that's not where most of our users sit, so we should kind of make sure that the biggest use cases are supported first, and then we kind of scale that. Is analysis automated? We've recently talked to, I think LinkedIn was it? And a couple of the companies, and what we see is that companies either scale by throwing analysts at the problem. They hire just tons of analysts. One company we talked to had 1/3 of the company were analysts. And you can do that, but if you are us, and that's not the way you're set up necessarily, isn't really an option. So what you need to do is kind of, you just need to automate in order to get work off the analysts and into the platform. And then also, and that kind of leads me to the next point, are the best practices built into the tooling? What we've had at Spotify for a couple of years now is this platform that was born as a rollout platform, and that is pretty much a great tool if you know exactly what you're doing. You know, if you're great at engineering, if you're great at statistics, if you're great at analysis, then it kind of works for you. Because it's kind of almost like a free form SDK. But as soon as you're not solid on any of these points, then the process can fall apart. Because you can look at data, not questioning what the underlying observations are, and suddenly you're kind of applying the wrong test, or you're taking your cue from the wrong graph, and then you're screwed. So that leads us to this process. And the first question is, do ownership and expertise exist? So ownership obviously really important to have good metrics, to have a good process. You know, if I run A/B tests and then the team that owns the neighbor feature, they run A/B tests in a shitty way and they kind of screw with my feature, like who do I go to, who tells them to stop that? Do we have shared agreement on whether we should be testing everything or just a couple of things? Is the math legit? I'm quoting a colleague here who said that in a presentation, and it's kind of just down to like, is the stats you're applying okay, right? So that's nothing we need to talk about here. You probably want to either look up a stats textbook or even better get some consulting or something, but just make sure that that part is not falling apart. And lastly, is the constant validation. I think that's actually one thing that's really important to stress. whether that's AA tests, so where you run 2 test cells that have the same content, you just look whether the numbers are as they should, similar across this, or anything else. Just kind of don't trust best practices and don't always trust your platform, right? Have measures in place that constantly check whether everything you want to happen is actually happening, and the contrary. And that's something where we see ourselves fail quite a bit to this point, where things are not automated, and we'll trust that part of the platform, and then suddenly kind of 5 A/B tests are invalid because, oh, guess what, didn't work. And lastly, the culture, which is the trickiest bit I find, because the first thing you need to ensure is that people actually adopt this mindset. Because if people still think they can get it right without experiments, then it'll just be like such an uphill battle. Luckily at Spotify, people are fairly open-minded and they very quickly coming around to the point that they can't always be right. Actually, in Dan McKinley's talk, if you see there's a nice graph where he shows Etsy's business numbers, and he's saying like, as long as your idea is cool and hip and you don't have any strong competition, your numbers will go up no matter what. So whatever you launch, it may seem like a success even though you're not actually making any dent in your growth curve, right? So what usually helps is if people get a bloody nose here and there, right? So kind of as soon as the first failure with a big project or something comes along, that's usually when people are susceptible for this idea that, hey, maybe we should actually control what we're doing. And then another big one is how failure and risk is being talked about. So like this whole thing about fear of failure is so popular that it's kind of already boring. It's one of these kind of axioms that everyone has accepted, but nobody's living them, right? Everyone's, oh yeah, it's okay to fail. Oh yeah, we need to fail more. But then you fail and like people get fired. And I find that really, really tricky to fix. And I think the first thing obviously is that you have to set like what failure means and what kind of failure is accepted and what isn't, right? As soon as you fail and you don't learn from it, then there should probably be some consequences for you. But if you fail early, if you fail cheaply, if you fail and you know what to do better, of course that's good. And I think kind of at that level there isn't really any disagreement. It's just that fear of failure and failing is good has become so commonplace that people kind of forget like the details of it. And lastly, are experiments driving or blocking? And that's, I think, something that we have struggled with, because if you're sitting in a place where you can launch quickly, and all the processes are working, and the company is all about run and break things and be fast and work in squads and autonomous and everything, then experimentation and like a proper scientific process and having to wait for your data, all of that is a blocker, and all of that has a cost to your business speed. And that's another thing that you kind of need to figure out a way of how to work around. And I would probably say this is still our biggest problem, not because people are not accepting it, but because it's just that if you want to be fast, but you also want to learn, like you have to make this trade-off every day. And if you have to give people answers quickly, because otherwise they will at some point lose patience or just fall back into their old rut, or just come to the conclusion that your this kind of experimental approach you're suggesting isn't worth doing. I'll give you one last example, which was one great learning for me, and that kind of goes back to the initial part about data and how data and actions work together, and also how experimentation and other types of research, I won't say qual, work together nicely and can really kind of get you to a different level of understanding. So we ran this experiment, super important, company priority number 1 at the time. So we really had all the incentive to get this right and understand it well. And the results came back and we had no clue what they meant. Right? It was just kind of a super weird result that made no sense whatsoever. Like some numbers were up, some numbers were down, and it wasn't kind of in a way where you're like, oh yeah, this makes intuitive sense. And deep dive after deep dive, it didn't become any clearer, so we ran a survey across both the test cells, asking for stuff like net promoter score, how easy do you find Spotify to use, how good is the content, are we getting the music recommendations right? And again, like a completely confusing picture. Most things were just like flat, a couple of probably false positives in there. So at this point, people were getting really uneasy because so much cost was sunk into this project, and we had committed to this kind of learning approach, right, where we test things and we don't just roll stuff out. So people were wanted to get answers because they were fundamentally blocked. And when we were getting really nervous, I decided to go back to that survey and look in this kind of what people had left here, right? So it's kind of the least place where you look at a researcher, or the last place. This is just kind of where people usually leave their ranting, and you suck, and I don't want to spend time in the survey, or I don't like the Spotify ads, please make it cheaper, like 50 cents a month, like all these kind of great suggestions. What I found was like a lot of this crazy stuff, like the radio station, we were testing radio stations. I listened to goes to a Spotify chosen station after a commercial, which made no sense whatsoever. But then there was more stuff like that, and it was really starting to get interesting because what all of these people were saying was essentially the same thing. Pick one out. When I listen to Spotify playlists on my phone, oftentimes after commercials, Spotify starts playing a different playlist, completely different genre, rather than bringing me back to my originally selected playlist. So this now suddenly makes sense because we were testing playlists, and this kind of behavior made more sense than this radio station stuff. Even though it appeared later that the person had just confused stations and playlists. So we started looking at user logs, right? So here we move into a different kind of data domain. Now we're looking at objective, behavioral, oh, hey, friends. At behavioral data at a much larger scale. I really enjoy your embarrassment right now. These are colleagues, by the way, so I can say that. And we saw this weird behavior here. So actually, after an ad is served, a Spotify user who has previously listened to the same playlist the whole time is suddenly being served a different playlist. And then he goes back to their other playlist, another ad, same experience, right? So now we have something. And we also reached out to people via email to understand better how this was actually affecting them. And I won't read out this one because it kind of has some strong language, but I choose a rap or hip hop station after the 30 minutes of no advertisement stops and I just start playing a song from today's topics or something along these lines. So we're completely killing the way that the app serves you music, right? We're completely destroying your flow. And in some cases they had really severe experiences and people said, I'm switching over to Pandora because of this. So it made all the sense in the world that this was actually tanking some of our main metrics. And going back to this, exploration and validation, this was a really nice example because we started here with a validation, right? A validation test. It didn't turn out the way we expected it. So our hypothesis was refused. We went back into exploration through a survey methodology, which is kind of, this kind of NPS closed multiple choice statements. It's kind of a mix between the two because you're exploring like a broader variety of data, but you're still kind of validating. You're looking, is one better than the other? And then at the end, we went back to the exploration. Suddenly we found something, right? We found an idea, like just a comment that gave us some clue, built a new hypothesis, went back into the code, tested it, and yeah, that seemed to work. So we ran another A/B test after that, and it actually turned out to improve the situation quite a bit, which was great. And everybody was happy ever after. Couple of takeaways. So first of all, foster the dialogue between data and design, right? That's something that I'm fairly safe to say we kind of have adopted that by now, and it's something that really is immensely useful if you do that in a good way. So the SWOT system we're using, if you're familiar with that, where you have small product teams that work interdisciplinary, is a particularly great way for doing that if design and research both have a say at the table, because then you can actually have these meaningful discussions and make sure that design influences data and data influences design. Look at data in all its forms, so stop thinking in terms of either I'm talking to a person on the street or I'm SQLing for 6 hours. There's so many shades in between. Figure out what your question is and then kind of adjust the type of data you need for that. Sometimes you want to find out what people are feeling and thinking, sometimes you don't care, sometimes you want to know what they're doing. So really keep that distinction in mind. And lastly, as shown by that example, keep cycling through that cycle. That's super important. Never, and it's so easy to get stuck in one of the two modes, right? To only run these kind of large research pieces that throw up all this dirt and never really drive into any of these. and it's equally likely to run experiment after experiment after experiment without ever looking at, hey, what else is lying around here, right? Like an A/B test is like a sniper rifle. You get this one answer and you'll get it good, but you don't see what's around you while you're doing that. Cool. With that, I'm going to questions, but I'm not sure if you want to take questions later in the discussion or whether we do it now.
No, we don't know.
Cool. Oh, cool. That's one.
Hi, could you talk a bit about the challenges of making your business case for doing all this experimentation in a very fast-moving results-oriented environment? How do you not get fired?
Okay, my boss is sitting over there, so I should probably ask him. So the question was, how do we kind of justify the cost involved in making being fast-paced learning environment? So I guess in one way we're lucky because Spotify is still a pretty young company and they're like very strongly looking at all the other like industry leaders like Google and Facebook, and everyone's doing this, right? So kind of everyone's agreed like, yeah, we should be doing this. I think the bigger question is not necessarily how we get funding and how we get kind of the general like purpose or how people kind of get basic buy-in. I think the more important thing is what I mentioned earlier. Once you interfere with the daily process, right? As soon as you get in there and you're like, hey, stop, you should wait and do the right thing. That's usually the more tricky part. And I mean, I guess kind of, yeah, these are the answers that probably always come up, like human relationships. Building relationships between designers, researchers, and product people is super important. Like, send them to offsites, get them to kind of, drink a beer together. Really make sure that those people can talk because they all speak in very different languages in their job environment, so they have a human connection that really helps. Well, the other thing is buying. So what we've seen over the last year or so is that our leadership has started talking a lot more about learning. I'm not obviously 100% sure why that is, but apparently they kind of gotten around to that idea, and that really helps that people suddenly realize as soon as you say learning and experimenting that they've heard that before and that it's something that is supposed to be good. And then at the end of the day, it's just kind of doing good work, being careful that when you deliver research, you make sure that you don't overpromise, and that you kind of, if you find that something that probably a lot of researchers struggle with, and I've struggled with at times, of course, as well, as when you try to, when you have something that you think is right from your lens, and then you don't have the pragmatism to kind of relate to that other person's experience, then at the end of the day, that often means that your research will just go unnoticed. So making sure that when you do research or when you commission research or whatever, it's tied to actual kind of business outcomes, if it's tied to the actual development process, and people get value out of it.
So recently on your mobile app, I don't know if it's on Android, just on iOS, I'm an iOS user, you significantly changed the menu system. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and whether that was through this process of learning and experimentation?
Oh, very gladly. It's funny because I actually I worked on this project both as a researcher and with a team and trying to get them to run more and better experiments. And I think that was probably one of the best examples of the process I've just described, where we have a product owner who's extremely bought in to both design process and research and data of all forms. We have a designer who's a really strong research advocate. And we had like enough priorities, so actually the project was getting a lot of research. So it was probably like a half year process of different forms of exploration and validation. So we ran user tests, with different kind of prototypes where we told the designers, hey, go out there, do crazy things, go really far apart, do one thing with tabs and one thing with like 15 things in the hamburger and one thing with a hamburger on the right side, like all the crazy ideas. And then like we try to gather intel on that on a more iterative, quick user research basis. And then we ran, I don't know like how many, but at least kind of 4 or 5 different experiments on this, where we changed the tabs, the number of the tabs, what language we used. We tried the hamburger menu just with less options. And then after a while, we just realized, okay, now we have kind of all the puzzle pieces. We feel confident that this is a good thing. And then we launched it. And then the final test, obviously, always what Twitter says. And in that case, even that was good. So, yep.
How do you come up with your hypothesis in general? Is it inputs coming from the marketing department, like
good question. I feel most questions regarding Spotify, I always have to say like there is no straight answer because we're such a big bunch and so autonomous that like all answers probably apply. I would like to say it's all based in research and previous learnings and people just go and refine and do stuff, which may be true to an extent. Like we have kind of a culture where like a lot of stuff is flying around in emails and kind of different knowledge shares. So I'm assuming people see data and they go and be like, oh, I built a hypothesis of this. I mean, also what they look into what other competitors are doing, what they themselves probably more often than not are doing with the app, and then we have to sometimes go and say, hey, remember you're not your users. Your user probably knows less about music than you, etc. I would say kind of everything from teams who are really structured and very scientific, working on the back of previous research, all the way up to someone just having a gut feel and a good idea. And I mean, so for example, like Discover Weekly, I presented that earlier. I'm not 100% confident, but I think that was a project that was pretty, like, I think it first served as a hack in the company, so people just tried stuff out, realized it worked, and then kind of switched over to that whole research process.
So, a couple of questions. The first one is, how do you, because obviously you're trying to improve the product that you have, but when you do that, when you're thinking about sort of testing roadmap or whatever, right, when you're thinking about it, there's a difference between you're optimizing the product that you have and you're actually trying to create a testing roadmap that will give you learnings. And I find that really tricky to do in kind of understanding how do I start planning that? Because that would tie into my second question in terms of how do you sort of prioritize what you need to start with? Because conversion rate, whatever, this and that, and how do you do that?
I guess that's a super hard question. If I knew that, we would all be happier. I think kind of one part of that answer is that in most companies you will probably have like a natural tendency. So right at Spotify, it's like a startup that grew very quickly. So people have this natural explorer mindset of just trying crazy new things. Before that, I worked at a shopping company where the mindset was completely the opposite. So it was very incremental, very kind of small gains, because every small gain makes a lot of money. And I guess that's probably less a question to research and more one to kind of strategy and product development to find that trade-off and what you're happy with. I guess going down back to experimentation, it comes down to how many experiments do you run that are iterations and based on previous experiments that you've run successfully, and just tweak them, and how many of your experiments are things where you say, okay, this is like a big project where we give you like half a year to build something, and then you just try to validate that. I can't say we have solved that answer. I think it's just kind of something that every company, depending on where they are in the competitive landscape, have to think about the whole time and make sure that their research, experimentation, and building processes align to what they actually want to do. Because if you really want to kind of break new ground and you're just implementing the whole time, that's wrong, but the other way around kind of is probably also a problem. Best question, best answer I could have.
You talk about having autonomous teams.
Yeah.
And obviously you guys are generating all these experiments and this data. Do you tend to be the only team that runs the experiments and disseminates the information, or do you kind of give lots of different teams their own authority to run their own experiments? And if so, how on earth do you control that?
Yeah, no, it's the first. So people are doing their own stuff, otherwise that our model wouldn't really work. So I think at Spotify, to be successful, you kind of need to find some way of platformizing things, because there's too many people running too fast in order to kind of build gates for them or control everything or handhold everything. So I think scaling is really a crucial problem. I mean, you can talk to David later, he probably knows more about that, but I mean, we're cycling back and forth, I think, through different approaches to how much centralized work do you do? Where you have a central research team, a central design team, and they're building things that are either a vision for everyone to align around or a project for everyone or whatever, and just kind of making sure that everyone has infrastructure and then they can do stuff. And I think even on the macro level of the company, that kind of, as the years come and go, it kind of sometimes shifting. Sometimes it's more like tilting towards that, then it's like, oh, Apple is doing something, we need to react, now everyone needs to do this. So yeah, again, something that I find hard to answer on a general level. But at least from the research and data management perspective, I think we're now pretty much having the perspective that we need to have all these basic infrastructure things covered. So like having a central repository for all the insights we have and all the data we have, right? Central ownership for metric pipelines and all that. So while we don't have all that in place quite yet, that's, I guess, the direction we're taking. One more? Okay, one more.
What tends to be the point when a result is significant? At what point do you say, okay, this experiment has stopped, we've got enough data, we now are confident making a decision?
Well, the point, so my personal thought on that is that we probably then want to run another experiment to replicate that one and see if both results match up, to kind of eliminate the chance that, the first one was just a false positive. At the like, to the rest, kind of, it's obviously before the experiment, you look at what kind of level of an effect you want to measure, then you put your sample size on that, and then you wait until that time is gone, you have that sample size, right, to calculate your test. So I guess for me it's a little bit of a mix of the statistical process, like how you should be doing things, you shouldn't peek in between, all that kind of stuff that you can read everywhere on the internet, and then the second part of it is the culture. So how happy are we to take the risk that we implement something that's not right? And I think you can have, depending on where in your app you're doing that, on your product, or what kind of product you can have very different approaches to that. So to give an example, like if you build on a feature for 3 months, right, and you want to launch it, and you're testing that, you really want to make sure that works. So you probably want to test it once or twice, you want to test it with really small confidence intervals, you want to really kind of make sure that's right. If you, on the other hand, kind of just circulating content to people on a daily basis, like Discover Weekly, for example, you want to test how good is my Discover Weekly kind of hit rate. Well, maybe I'm okay taking like the occasional false positive if that means I can ship faster or I can iterate faster. So again, it's like a process thing coming down to culture maybe. Cool. Any other questions maybe we can take up later? I guess I'll take that.